If you've watched the new Wuthering Heights with Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi and caught yourself wondering, okay, but which adaptation of this novel actually gets it right? This is the video that will answer that for you, because nearly every adaptation from 1939 until now makes some sort of compromise on the novel. It simplifies a story that was never meant to be simple, and I don't think that's accidental. I think Wuthering Heights is fundamentally resistant to film. And I don't say that casually, because this isn't just another classic book to me. And hi, my name is Cassidy Krieger from Hollywoodland Photos. Wuthering Heights is a novel that I have lived with since I was 17. I've read it and reread it once a year, if not more. I've performed Cathy on stage. I've travelled to Haworth, been on the moors, been to the Bronte Parsonage Museum. This book lives in my soul because it's one of those books that gets under your skin and doesn't leave. And what has always fascinated me is how misunderstood this story actually is. Culturally, we've been taught that Wuthering Heights is a tragic love story. But when you read the book, you realise it's something far more unsettling. It's about obsession, it's about class humiliation, it's about emotional abandonment, and it's about trauma that doesn't just wound, it repeats. Heathcliff and Cathy aren't the ending, they're the wound. And that's why cinema keeps struggling, because cinema likes arcs, it likes romance, and it likes resolution. But Emily Bronte wrote something structurally and psychologically unruly, and that unruliness doesn't sit comfortably inside 2 hours. And it all starts here, the 1939 adaptation of Wuthering Heights. But it wasn't just an adaptation, it was the machine that built the myth. William Wyler's Hollywood version, with Laurence Olivier and Mel Oberon as Heathcliff and Cathy, takes Emily Bronte's jagged, multi-generational novel and selects a single spine, the tragic romance. It adapts only 16 of the novel's 34 chapters, cutting the second generation entirely, and in doing so, it doesn't just shorten the story, it redefines it, and it redefines it for generations after. Because when you end the story with Cathy's death, you freeze the narrative at its most seductive point, longing, regret, and doomed love. You don't have to sit in the aftermath of it, the uncomfortableness of it, the what happens afterwards. You don't have to watch the obsession mutate into inheritance. You don't have to watch the trauma cycle play out in the children, because that isn't fun to watch on screen. It makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. And that's why the 1939 adaptation is so culturally powerful. It's stunning. It's romantic. It's beautifully shot. So beautifully that it won the Oscar for Best Cinematography. The film didn't misunderstand the novel. It created a version of the novel, the story, that cinema and the general public going to the movies could fall in love with. And to be honest, it's the one I fell in love with. It's how I discovered Wuthering Heights all those years ago and set me down a path of the deepest love story with this story. The problem is many people who don't read the novel think this is it, and most adaptations have been chasing that shadow ever since. And then 1970 comes along and you can practically feel it trying to modernise the charge. This is the version starring Timothy Dalton as Heathcliff and Anna Calder Marshall as Cathy, and like 1939, it largely adapts only the first 16 chapters, ending with Cathy's death and omitting the children's story. So structurally, it stays inside the same trap, make it about the lovers and the romantic peak. But 1970 adds something else, something really telling. It makes deliberate changes that shift the moral gravity. In this version, Hindley, Cathy's brother, is portrayed more sympathetically than usual. And the film even introduces the controversial ending where Hindley fatally shoots Heathcliff, a choice that completely alters the novel's eerie, unresolved haunting. So what I find so fascinating about the 1970 adaptation is it shows you what cinema often does when it can't hold Bronte's architecture, just like the latest adaptation. It compensates with plot intervention. It reshapes the story into something that feels like a completed tragedy, neat, sealed, finished. But Wuthering Heights is not neat, and the neatness is exactly what makes it less Bronte. A couple of decades pass, and then 1992 arrives and does something genuinely important in mainstream cinema and Wuthering Heights. It refuses to end where the myth of Wuthering Heights ends. Peter Kaminsky's film, with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche as Heathcliff and Cathy, is specifically noted for including the oft-omitted second generation. And this is where I get passionate, because to me, the second generation is not optional when you tell this story. It's the moral backbone of the book. Without it, you lose the redemption arc. There is no breaking of the cycle, no proof that obsession doesn't have to become legacy. And if Heathcliff and Cathy are the wound, the second generation are the scar forming over it. Then we come into 2009, the adaptation that is possibly what I feel is the closest to the novel. The ITV miniseries doesn't just include the second generation, it gives the story space to breathe, and I think that's really important. This is a 2-part series starring real-life husband and wife, Tom Hardy and Charlotte Riley as Heathcliff and Cathy. And because it has a bit more runtime, it doesn't rush Cathy's childhood, which is important. It doesn't skim Heathcliff's humiliation, which is important. And doesn't treat the aftermath as optional, which is important. Hardy's Heathcliff isn't polished. He isn't framed as safely romantic. He feels coiled, physical, and dangerous. There's magnetism there, absolutely, but it isn't comforting. And that matters because Heathcliff isn't meant to be aspirational or sexy or someone that you want in your bedroom. But what really sets 2009 apart is what happens after Cathy dies. It doesn't fade to black, it continues. It shows Hareton growing up inside bitterness. It shows you young Cathy inheriting the wreckage of 2 houses. And suddenly the story becomes bigger than obsession. It becomes inheritance, both physical and mental, and about whether cruelty repeats itself or can be unlearned. That's why, to me, the 2009 adaptation comes so close, not because it's perfect, it's not by far, there are so many faults to it, but because it honours something essential. Consequence across generations, not just passion in a storm. And then we come to 2011, just 2 years later, and people love to adapt Wuthering Heights because filmmaker Andrea Arnold saw what had happened before and said enough with the romantic varnish of this story. This version, starring James Howson as Heathcliff and Kea Scodelario, God I hope I said that right, as Cathy, is explicitly described as concentrating largely on the childhood and adolescence of Heathcliff and Cathy, meaning again the film leans more into the first half of the story. It is also the first adaptation of Wuthering Heights that has a person of colour playing Heathcliff, which is important because Emily Bronte did write Heathcliff as racially ambiguous. But tonally, this is where it's radical. The Guardian describes Arnold and cinematographer Robbie Ryan as stripping the story down to its bare essentials: pain, anger, and love. This adaptation doesn't try to make Heathcliff charming at all. It doesn't try to make the moors look pretty. It makes the world feel physical, harsh, like the land itself is complicit in this story, and I really think it is. And it's important because it swings the pendulum back towards something more Bronte-esque, that this isn't a love story you're meant to want. It's the story that you're meant to survive. But because it concentrates on that earlier section, you're left in the wound, again, not the scar, and that's the pattern once again. Cinema can do brutality, cinema can do romance, but cinema can sometimes struggle to do the full moral architecture. And then we're in 2026, so we've had 15 years of no Wuthering Heights. I'm not going to fully get into the latest adaptation. I've done a full breakdown of my very, very, very honest thoughts about why I did not like it. I will link it wherever you can link things on YouTube. But just quickly, Emerald Fennell's adaptation with Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi as Cathy and Heathcliff has been wildly discussed. Widely and wildly, to be honest, for taking liberties and, crucially, only adapting, once again, the first half of the novel. I want to be calm and analytical about this, maybe more calm and analytical than I was in my review of the movie. This isn't automatically wrong, but it's familiar, because once you've seen how the 1939 adaptation shaped culture, you start to recognise the modern pattern. When filmmakers return to first half only Wuthering Heights, they're not really adapting Bronte, they're adapting the myth of Bronte. And that's why people walk out thinking it's a doomed romance when the novel is actually about obsession, class, race, and trauma cycles echoing forward. And I think truly that's much more interesting. I don't think any film fully gets Wuthering Heights, and I don't think they ever can. The novel is too psychologically dense, too structurally bold, and too morally uncomfortable. Modern audiences are conditioned to expect a Jane Austen-style romantic arc, longing, conflict, resolution. But Wuthering Heights never resolves like that. It doesn't reward you for loving Heathcliff. It doesn't tidy up obsession into romance. It doesn't end at the most emotionally satisfying moment. It keeps going, and that's what makes the book so unsettling. Cinema keeps trying to sand it down into something that we as an audience recognise, but Bronte wrote something far less polite. Read the book, because no film can fully hold what she wrote. Cinema will keep trying to simplify Wuthering Heights, but the novel refuses to be simplified. And that's probably why we're still arguing about it all these years later.